Good day to you. Are you a man or a woman? Are you male or female? Do you have masculinity or femininity? Strange questions, huh? It's actually strange to consider this whole subject in many ways because our language does not allow us to drill down into discussing it at quite the level of depth that I think really one needs. But nevertheless, we should talk about women and femininity and men and masculinity in the context of culture because it has such a big impact on the way that cultures operate around the world. So that's our subject for today. We're taking on the culture specifically of women, though by implication we will necessarily be talking about men as well. And it's very interesting right from the get-go to emphasize that the word gender is a modern word. It wasn't really around until the 1800s. And what the word gender is, or how it came about, I should say, is in recognition that sex is biological. You're born a male or you're born a female depending on your chromosomes. But gender is how you are treated based on a society's perception of how feminine people should be treated versus masculine people. So gender is socially constructed. Just like when you see a young boy playing with a toy, and if the young boy picks up a doll, a female doll, there's going to be somebody that says, hey, check this out, check this truck out. That is a gender-related behavior. It's how society in America can treat somebody based on the perception of their femininity or masculinity. In actual fact, gender is something that has come to be understood as on a sliding scale today, and that the average person may consider themselves not necessarily masculine or necessarily feminine, but to look at that as a continuum where there are different traits and behaviors that may be more feminine than masculine, as if, for example, in Europe, men often cross their legs. They cross them like this, as opposed to this, which is what we're taught is a more appropriate behavior for the male gender in the United States. And so it's a sliding scale, masculinity and femininity. And so now let's dig into this subject. Let's talk about the United Nations studies first. They came up with something called the HDI, or the Human Development Index, and it measures a lot of things about a person's life that have to do with their general welfare. And so it measures, for example, how long people live. It measures the occupations it measures how long people live. It measures their level of knowledge, and it measures their standard of living. And generally speaking, the countries that fall at the top of that are Western countries, and in particular, Norway is the #1 country for the highest HDI, followed by Australia, followed by the US. The US is in the 3rd position. But the amazing thing about that study is it shows that not a single country, and there are 200 countries in the world, and I've given you a map, by the way, on D2L today that I encourage you I'd even stop the video right now if you can and bring that map up, because we're going to be doing a trip around the world as we talk about women. But if you look at the map, you'll see that there is no country out of the 200 that treat women as well as men are treated. And that's a pretty profound statement. Within the United Nations research, they also came up with something called the Gender Inequality Index. And the Gender Inequality Index looks specifically at maternal mortality, women who die as a result of giving birth. It also looks at adolescent fertility. That means the age at which women are having babies, 13, 14, 15, as young as that. It looks at higher education for women, and it looks at their participation in the workforce. So all of these things go together to look at the Gender Inequality Index, and the U.S. actually ranks 42, which is pretty low down there. The Netherlands is the best country to be a woman in as far as equality goes, followed by Sweden and Denmark. Those are known as Nordic countries. They're in the north of Europe. I have a lot of experience in those countries, and I'll be talking about some of that in my video lecture today. One big finding by the United Nations study is that income is not necessarily related to equality between the genders. Income is not necessarily related. We'll see that in the United States, where income is pretty high for females compared to other countries. Okay, in addition to the UN study, there was another study that was done. It was by the World Economic Forum, and this study was based on looking at the health, education, politics, and economic opportunity for women. And it found that across the world, the health gap, the difference between men being healthy and women being healthy, has been closed for 96% of the population. That's pretty amazing. There's still 4% difference there between men and women when it comes to the health. And actually, if you look at these selected countries, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, those countries are accounting for 28% of the world's births. So a quarter of the world's births are coming just from 3 countries, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And within those countries, 46% of maternal deaths are based in those countries. So there's a lot of concentration in those countries of the female health problems, even though the overall health problem, health inequity, has been closed. The countries that are following have more male births than other countries, and that was not really explained in the chapter, but it's interesting to note that. So we have China, India, Armenia, Vietnam, Azerbaijan, Curacao, and Georgia. See if you know where these countries are on the top of your head. Do you know, for example, that Armenia is a former Soviet republic, and it's based on the east and the north of the eastern part of the world? Or Vietnam, can you find that on a map? Or Curacao, that's an island in the Caribbean. Or Georgia, that's also a former Soviet republic. This study, the World Economic Study, also keyed in that there's a lot of inequities in the way that women are treated when it comes to the law. So, for example, the murder of a wife in some Latin American countries is excusable if the husband caught the wife having an affair. It's an excusable act of violence. And there are some countries that have no laws whatsoever that are against the violence committed to women. We find that in some Middle Eastern countries. And to continue with this theme, approximately 1/3 of the women in many countries are reporting sexual abuse at some age. So about 1/3 of all women across the world report some form of sexual abuse. And of course, there's the whole problem of trafficking of human beings, particularly women, not only women, men too, but women forced into prostitution, promised in China, for example, jobs, and then brought into Western countries, and then their passports taken, and then they are forced into prostitution to exist. Now, when we're changing the subject to education, we just looked at health. When we change it to education, 93% of the gap in education has been closed. So women today, and especially in the United States, are increasingly the majority of the gender that is enrolled in higher education. Here at ESU, almost 60% of our students are women, and that's just an example that's going on across the world. Most of the illiterate women, 2/3 of them, we should say it this way, of the people who are illiterate, they cannot read or write in the world, 2/3 of them are women. So that's a big number. And mostly the women who are illiterate are based in Asia and Africa. Now, moving to economics, only 60% of the economic gap has been closed. So 40% of men are still making way more than women. In the U.S. here in the U.S., about 76%. That's the average wage, percentage of wage that a woman is earning compared to a male. So if they do the same job, about 3/4 pay is what the female is receiving compared to the male. Now, it's a little bit misleading because part of that, if you read the book, is because women are available less hours to work because they are child raising, so they can't do that 40-hour work week, so that brings wages down. And also more traditional jobs for females, such as secretarial jobs or hairdresser jobs, those jobs tend to be lower paying than manager jobs or sales jobs. So that was also feeding into that 76% wage inequity there. We do have a law in this country, the 1963 Equal Pay Act, which made it illegal to pay women differently from men. But as I just cited, for those other 2 reasons, we still have not closed that gap. When it comes to political participation, it's the worst across the world when it comes to equality between the genders. Only 20% of the gap has been closed for political participation. And historically, it was only in the 20th century that women began to have the right to vote. So it's only, it's just 200 years old, that right for women to participate in politics. And the variation is tremendous depending on what part of the world you look at. If you look at the Nordic countries, again, the Sweden, Denmark, Finland, those countries, Norway, they have 41% of their elected representatives are women. whereas if you look at the Arab countries, only 13% of the elected representatives are women. More countries, by the way, are trying to add quotas to fix this. They're saying that X amount of women have to be X amount of the positions have to be held by women in cabinets, in Congress, in Parliament, whatever the government system is. Now, speaking of the Nordic countries, let's start to move to specific regions so that we can highlight some of the things going on in there when it comes to looking at the culture of women. We'll talk about the Nordic countries. I've spent a lot of time in Sweden. It's amazing to me that country. I'll even give a brief example that if a female wants to have a sexual relationship with a male, she often, even if it's a one-night stand, so to speak, it's perfectly acceptable in most Swedish families for the female to bring the male to her house. And not only is it comfortable for him to stay there, but the next morning he usually joins the family for breakfast. And the reasoning being that men and women alike want their daughters to be where they know that they are safe, rather than in a place that, under an underpass, for example, or in a park or a car or something like that. It's better that they have that safety of the household. And it just speaks to how women have more equality in Sweden. It's one of many examples that I see in Sweden, which is, of course, a Nordic country. So the Nordic countries rank very high in femininity. Now, there's a concept that we spoke about from a prior chapter. Femininity refers to those countries where there is less of a difference in what a male does versus what a female does. Masculine cultures, on the other hand, there are very distinct differences. Women are not allowed to drive buses in Mexico. We talked about that example earlier. That's an example of a country with high masculinity. There's different theories of why women have such equality in this part of the world. One of them I'm not quite certain of. The book talks about is how the Vikings, when they would go sailing around the world and coming as far as North America, the women would actually run the towns. So very early on they had equality that other women in other countries do not have. But also the governments in these countries have created a lot of equality for women by doing things like inexpensive childcare, allowing them to be able to afford childcare so that they can go to work, or offering free contraception so that the birth control is something that is readily available, or free abortion so that a woman is not made to have a baby against her desires. And then parental leave is very, very generous. Parental leave is when you're at a workplace, you have a baby, and your job is guaranteed, while you're also guaranteed to have 12 weeks off or however long it is so that you can raise that child and be there during those absolutely critical early months of a child's life. Moving on now to Mexico, we have almost the opposite. Mexico has a history of chauvinism. I also have a lot of experience in Mexico, and I do see that the average family in Mexico is structured around the needs, the wants, the desires of the man of the house. The man comes home and has had a hard day at work, and the woman's expected to have a really nice meal. And Mexican women in general, they like to do that. They like to make their husband a meal and feel that, the best way to a man's heart is through his stomach. You kind of see that in Mexico. Unfortunately, Mexico has a history and continuing history of physical and sexual violence to women. And you find women are abused in certain parts of Mexico, not all. Most of the people that I know are, embodying what we would consider to be American-style families. But there are many places in Mexico where the female is in a very subjugated role. For years, Mexico as a country was governed only by members of the revolutionary family, the people who broke away from Spain, and they were males with Spanish heritage. So it's a very patriarchal society, and this whole cultural value of machismo, the male looking very, very masculine all the time with the black cowboy hat and the jeans and the rugged clothes. You just see men. They look like what the traditional conception of masculinity is thought to be. And even the main religious figure that Mexicans look towards, the Lady of Guadalupe, her story, is one of suffering and sacrifice. And so it's embedded in their culture that women also take on this role to some extent. Moving now to China. China, like other countries, has a Confucian tradition. It's an ancient spiritual philosopher, I guess you could look at him as. And that puts male superiority over females. Males are superior by their birth. So that makes boys more valued than females in society. And in China, it had that one-child policy, which has changed to two-children policy, where a family can have no more than 2 children if one of the parents is a single child also. That's what the law says. They're trying to control their population because it can't feed itself. that has led to more male centricism, because if you're a family and you have a female child, one of the options for you is to put your child up for adoption so that you can have another chance to get a male to continue on the family name, to pass down inheritances, and to have a patriarchal role in society. So you still have that happening in China. But the Communist Party, interesting to note, was the party that opened up equality for women. You would think it being such a controlling political philosophy that might not, but actually it abolished the concubine laws, the ability to put a woman into basic sexual slavery for a man's desire. It also gave women the right to own property, and it allowed women to choose their husbands as opposed to having a husband forced on them, and also made divorce legal. And actually, China is one of the highest countries has one of the highest divorce rates in the world today. Moving on to Japan now. Japan's gone back and forth. In the 12th century, women could own their own property and manage their own property, but then that was taken away again in just before 1900, in 1898, because of the Meiji Civil Code. You can get the spelling on that from the book. It denied women legal rights and made them subject to their husbands' demands. So Japan today is still a country that has high masculinity, big differences between what men and women can do. But at the same time, an anomaly, that means a difference, is that it is extremely high on women's health. Women outlive men by far in Japan. And then when you look at the political system, though, only 13% of the legislatures are made up by women. So really below Arab states there as far as female participation. Only 13% of those seats are held by women. Moving on to South Korea now. Hope you're checking out the map as we go through this here. South Korea has also a Confucian tradition where the woman has a duty to attend to her husband's needs. And in fact, in the tradition of South Korea, a woman who did not deliver a healthy son to a family could actually be driven from the household. Think about how barbaric that is. A woman is being blamed for not delivering a healthy son, so she can be driven from the household. Today, the oldest son in South Korea is held in high esteem because of the importance placed on male lineage. And the bride is expected to adapt to the husband's household ways. The bride doesn't bring her own method of cooking and cleaning. The bride comes in and, let's say, for example, the male eats at a certain time, but the female didn't. Now the female has to adapt to that. South Korea is an extremely homogeneous country. It's made almost of pure Koreans, 80%, and the rest of them, the majority, are Chinese. So there's a lot of sameness of people. And once again, we see low participation in the political process. Only 15% of elected representatives are South Korean women. Moving on to India now, the country that's predicted to going to be surpassing China as having the biggest population in the world by 2020. India is a Hindu country, that's the religion, and it has certain dimensions of it that affect the way that women are treated. It is interesting to note that there's a thriving economy in India. You probably have spoken to somebody in an Indian call center when you've called a company and gotten customer service. There's a lot of jobs in India that are in that sector, but 300 million people live in poverty. 300 million people, that's almost the entire population of the United States, which is around 330 million. So that's a lot of people in poverty. And in fact, the literacy rate for women in India is only 48%. It's not very high. Less than half of people who are females are literate in India. There's a lot of violence against women, particularly rape, which has been on the rise. And females are also seen as less desirable by some families because it's an expense. An expense because in Indian marriage tradition, you're supposed to get a dowry when you marry the female. The dowry is provided by the female's parents. A dowry is it's a treasure trove. It's got cash, it's got jewelry in it, it's got assets that people have invested in. That's what a dowry is. And so it's an expense if you have a female that you're not expected to bear if you have a male. There's also a high rate of female infanticide. That means females being put to death at birth because they are female. They go missing and then they aren't documented as to where they've gone. And in fact, to try and protect against this, India's passed laws to prohibit doctors from giving out the sex of the baby before the baby is born, so the parents don't know what they're going to have, and then terminate the pregnancy just based on whether it's a female. India is one of those countries that has established quotas for its parliament to say that a certain amount of seats have to be female, so it's trying to make some amends. Moving on to sub-Saharan Africa now, that part of Africa that is below the Sahara Desert in the north. Patriarchal societies are the order of the day here in those countries. And it's so severe that in countries like Zimbabwe, there's a law that women simply are not equal to men by virtue of their birth, and that they are to be treated as, get this, a junior male across Zimbabwe. Congo, meanwhile, is known as the rape country of the world. 1,152 rapes occur every day in the Congo. 1,152 rapes every day in the Congo. Now, in those countries that fought against colonial rule, I'm talking about Portugal came to Africa, I'm talking about how Britain came to Africa, I'm talking about how the Netherlands came. Of the countries that fought against that rule, that had a revolution to overturn, those countries tend to have better rights for females. But still, across Africa, you have half of the world's maternal, newborn, and child deaths are still occurring in Africa. Half of them are in Africa. Now let's move to the Arab states. In pre-Islamic Arabia, we studied Islam in our last class. We studied Saudi Arabia. In pre-Islamic Arabia, which would be the 600s, female infants could be buried alive. That was the importance of the male. So the Quran actually revolutionized females' lives. We talk about the Quran as being a very comprehensive document that gets into many dimensions of human interaction. It created equality for women. All people are created equal in Allah's eyes, Allah being the Islamic God. However, the actual practices, as we know, have not met the ideals of Islam, so the book at least explains the sexism that still exists in Arabia as being more cultural than it is religious. So today, the man is considered as a descendant of the family only of his father and his father's family. So a man as a descendant is not descended from the female. That's very, very strange concept to us in America. Similarly, a Muslim can, by law of the Quran, actually have 4 wives at the same time, but a woman can only marry one man. And a man can terminate a marriage by saying, "I divorce you," in front of a witness, and no reason has to be given. So the law favors men in that respect. In Saudi Arabia, no female can sit on the king's cabinet, the closest advisory group, by law, no female. And it wasn't until 1999 that women were able to drive cars, but they need permission from their husband in the glove box on a written document, and they can only drive during the daylight. Still today in Saudi Arabia, all public facilities are segregated by sex. If you go to a restaurant and it's a takeout restaurant, they have a line for female and a line for men. And the clothing that they wear, the abaya, which covers them all up except for a slit for their eyes, is another example of how women, the laws are supposedly to protect them from unwanted advances by men and strangers. Now we're going to move away from specific countries. We're going to talk about the institution of marriage. And marriage is treated very differently across the world depending on where you are. And culturally, there's a lot of differences as well. Generally speaking, in collectivist countries, those countries where the group matters more, the age differences are larger. A lot of times marriages are arranged by the parents, and they're arranged, and the male is often the older one and the female is often the younger one. And husbands tend to be wealthier than those countries where there's more individualism. Looking at countries that have more masculinity to them, countries where there's a definite division between what women do and what men do, the value virginity is valued more in those countries than in countries like Nordic countries where virginity is not an issue for most people. In Western countries, we've seen marriage waning. We've seen more divorces. Here in the United States, over 60% of marriages have ended in divorce. But at the same time, divorce is linked to poverty because more than half of one-parent family homes are considered in the poverty category, more than half of single-family homes. Now let's move to the family unit itself. The family unit, you've got the nuclear family, which would be 2 parents and their unmarried children. That's a nuclear family. Then you have the extended family, which you find more in collectivist cultures. And the female plays a role in this because in the extended family, the grandparents live with them as well as possibly relatives by marriage can be living with you as well. We see that here in Pennsylvania in the Amish communities. You marry into a family and they build a house right next door. Now, in certain countries, you find a higher degree of what is known as exogamy. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. Exogamy, I think that's how you say it. E-X-O-G-A-M-Y, exogamy. This is where you marry outside of a defined group. So if you grew up in the United States, do your parents have an expectation that you'll marry another Catholic person or another Jew? Do they have an expectation that you'll marry an Italian? Do they have an expectation that you'll marry somebody who is interested in sports? Do they have an expectation that you'll marry somebody who has an advanced degree? Do they have an expectation that you marry somebody who's from the Northeast? These are examples of expectations. So exogamy is marrying outside of that kind of a group. Whereas endogamy, E-N-D-O, endogamy, is marrying within a defined group, staying within your religion, staying within your ethnicity, staying within your geography, staying within other family values. And now that brings us to the final concept for today, which is gender and communication. In masculine and in both in countries where there are words that have masculine spellings of them, most Mediterranean languages, Italian, Spanish, French, have masculine forms of words and feminine forms of words. You can say la tienda, for example, the store is a feminine word. L-A is la, so it's making it a feminine, has a feminine article to it. So you do find that there are gender differences in some languages. We don't have that here in the United States, but we do have the second dimension of gender and communication. That is a lack of counterpart words. You can call a group of people guys, but there is no counterpart word to that. You can't say gals. It's not the same thing, as I noted in an earlier class. Similar, the words that we have to swear at women are much more harsh. The C word, for example, is a much harsher word for most people than the D word used to describe a male. So there are inequities in the power of language when you're trying to find counterpart words to describe both males and females. And then you have countries like in Swaziland in Africa, where the Zulu language is such that women have to use different words than men, if just by virtue of being a woman when you're describing the same thing. An object, a woman uses a different word than a male. So across the world, we see a lot of differences in the way that women are treated, the main point being that women do not have equality in any single country, but there have been major advances made with some room still to go. I hope you have a great day.